Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. Diep stood at the market, her voice a soft thread woven into Tet's hum, offering pumpkins under the morning's frail light. Each gourd, heavy with earth's promise, gleamed like a small sun, but her heart wavered, a leaf caught in wind, wondering if James, tangled in his crumbling empire, still saw her as enough. The phone in her pocket, his gift, pulsed like a second heart, a bridge to a world she feared she'd never reach. Hockey waited at home, his loyalty a quiet him, but a stranger's warning, stay away from him, lingered sharp as a blade, cutting through the warmth of a gift she'd found, a box of flowers blooming with James's love. The market's clamor rose, voices bartering hope, and she stood, her hands trembling, selling not just pumpkins but fragments of a dream she clung to, fragile as moonlight on a stream. The pumpkins, round and warm, were more than fruit. They were Tet's vow, a whisper of plenty in a village where want was a constant guest. She'd carried them from the fields, her sandals sinking into mud, her arms aching but her heart steady, each step a prayer for James, for a life beyond the shack's patched roof. Her past was a shadow heavy with loss, parents gone, an uncle's betrayal, a childhood sold for coins. At 5 she'd learned hunger. At 12 she'd fled, her name her only map. School had faded at 9, its letters a distant song, and she'd married at 16. A girl bound to a man whose hands bruised her dreams. She'd escaped, built this life, hockey a garden, James, but the phone, its screen a puzzle, was a mirror to her lack, and she trembled, her love for him a flame that flickered but held. She offered a pumpkin to an uncle, his face lined with years, his voice warm with memory. No money, she said, her gift a small rebellion against want. And he smiled, his eyes bright, a fleeting bridge to a childhood she'd lost. The market pulsed, its stalls alive with Tet's promise, lanterns, rice cakes, the scent of citrus weaving through the air. She sold, her voice soft, her prices low, 10,000 dong a kilo, 15 for the best, and the coins clinked, each one a step toward James, toward a future she dared to dream. But the uncle's warning, don't trust James, clung like damp earth, and she faltered, her hands still, her heart racing, wondering what secrets James carried, what storms he hid. The phone had been his vow, a gift to light her path. Learn, he'd said, his voice warm, his fingers guiding hers over its buttons, and she'd nodded, her heart wide as the hills, her fear a shadow she'd pushed away. But learning was a mountain, its slopes steep with letters she'd forgotten, and she'd wept, alone in the shack, when she fumbled its screen. James had found her years ago, his truck stuck in mud, her laughter shy as she pushed. You're enough, he'd said, and she'd believed, her heart opening to a man who saw her, not her scars. But now his voice on the phone was tight, heavy with a storm she couldn't name, and she worked harder, her hands raw, selling pumpkins, tending hockey, chasing a dream that felt like chasing light. The market faded as she walked home, her basket empty, her heart full but fragile. The shack glowed, its roof a patchwork of hope, its yard alive with hockey's scamper and the cluck of chickens. She'd found it clean, the floors swept, the garden watered, a box of flowers blooming on the table, a gift from James, a vow for Valentine's dawn. Her heart lifted, a bird taking wing, but the uncle's words, he's not as good as you think, were a stone heavy in her chest. She knelt by hockey, his warmth a quiet balm and scattered feed, the chickens chatter a hymn to a life she'd built. The flowers, red as Tet's lanterns, were more than petals. They were James's heart, a promise that held her still, but doubt lingered, a whisper that she wasn't enough. James had come, his boots soft on the earth, his hands busy with care. He'd watered her garden, its leaves glistening like hope, and fed her chickens, their feathers bright in the dusk. The shack, once hers alone, now carried his touch, its walls warm with his effort, its air heavy with his love. He'd called, his voice a thread across the miles, and she'd answered, her heart racing, her fear raw but easing. I'm here, he'd said, and she'd smiled, her tears falling, his words a bridge to a future she couldn't see. But he hadn't stayed, his world pulling him back, a company cracking, a storm of voices demanding answers, and she stood, her hands still, wondering if his love, like the flowers, could endure the weight of doubt. His world was a storm, its winds sharp with betrayal. In a cafe, its air thick with dust, James sat, his voice low, his eyes sharp with resolve. He'd called Tuan, his aide, to find a lawyer, a man named Ha, whose hands were rough with earth, whose heart was steady with justice. Meet him today, James had said, and Tuan had nodded, his loyalty a quiet vow. The lawyer came, his face lined with years, his voice warm with purpose. John betrayed us, James said, his words heavy, his heart racing. He broke our terms, pulled capital, called others to follow. The papers spread before them, their ink a map of trust broken, and Ha nodded, his eyes steady, his voice a vow. I'll fight for you, he said. For the farmers, for the fields that wait. The project, twin son, was more than wood or water. It was a dream for the village, a dam to bring life to fields gone dry. John's betrayal had cracked it, his voice cold, his words a blade. Your family pays, ask your father. And James had faltered, his heart racing, his mind torn between fear and resolve. The workers came, their voices sharp, their eyes burning, demanding wages unpaid for 3 months, blaming him for fields that thirsted, for families that hungered. Why stop the dam? They'd asked, and he'd stood, his hands still, his heart heavy, knowing their anger was just, their need a mirror to his own. He'd vowed to fight, to hold his world, to keep Diep safe, but doubt pressed, a shadow that lingered, a fear that his love, his empire, could crumble. The lawyer Ha was more than a man. He was the earth itself, his roots deep in the fields, his heart wide as the hills. I take no coin till it's done, he'd said, and James had nodded, his faith a vow that held them still. The papers, their terms clear, were a fragile shield, their success a gamble, 70%, James had said, but the rest was fate, a storm he couldn't name. This dam is for them, he told Ha, meaning the farmers, the fields, the village that cradled Diep, and Ha had smiled, his eyes bright, his voice a hymn to a life he'd known. I was a farmer, he'd said, and James had felt it. A bond beyond words, a promise that warmed the cafe's dust. Diep's shack was a haven, its walls a canvas of memory. She'd returned, her heart racing, to find Min, the singer, waiting, his guitar a shield, his eyes soft with wonder. I saw you at the market, he'd said, and she'd nodded, her voice soft, her hands still. The flowers, James's gift, bloomed between them, their petals a question she couldn't answer. Who gave them? Min had asked, and she'd smiled, her heart wavering, her voice a whisper. My love, she'd said, meaning James, but Min's eyes held a spark, a vow she didn't want. I don't chase wealth, he'd said, his voice low, his song a thread to her heart. A small girl in a green field. The words lingered, a mirror to her pain, and she'd wept, her tears falling, her kindness a bridge to a stranger who saw her. Min's heart was a storm, its winds sharp with change. He'd sat by the market, his guitar a hymn, his voice low as he faced his brother, Hung, whose eyes were sharp with duty. Take the company, Hung had said, but Min had shaken his head, his heart set on music, his soul wide as the hills. Mother's sick, Hung had said, and Min had faltered, his fingers still, his heart a drumbeat against fear. But Diep's face, her tears had shifted something, and he'd smiled, his voice a vow. I'll return, he'd said, meaning the company, meaning her, and Hung had nodded, his boots heavy, his love a vow that held them still. Min's song Country Girl was more than notes. It was Diep's life, a gift he'd given, a spark he'd chase. The uncle, Kien, was a shadow, his voice sharp with warning. Stay away from James, he'd said, his eyes dark, his words a blade. Diep had stood, her basket heavy, her heart racing, wondering what he knew, what secrets he carried. His face was the village itself, its lines deep with memory, its eyes heavy with loss. He's not what you think, he'd said, and she'd nodded, her voice still, her fear a whisper that grew. The market's hum had faded, its voices a distant hymn, and she'd walked away, her hands trembling, her heart torn between James's flowers and Kien's warning, between a love she held and a doubt she couldn't name. The workers' voices were a storm, their anger a fire that burned. They'd come to James, their hands rough with labor, their eyes sharp with need. 3 months' wages, they'd said, and he'd stood, his heart heavy, his voice low. The dam stopped, they'd said, meaning twin son, meaning fields gone dry, meaning families that hungered. Their words were more than demands, they were the village's heart, its pulse a hymn to survival. James had nodded, his hands still, his mind racing, knowing their need was his own, their fight a mirror to his storm. He'd vowed to pay, to fight John, to hold the dam, but the worker's eyes lingered, a question he couldn't answer, a weight he carried alone. Diep's shack was a world, its walls warm with memory, its air heavy with hope. She'd knelt by Hockey, his warmth a quiet balm and scattered feed, the chickens chatter a hymn to a life she'd built. The flowers, James's gift, bloomed on the table, their petals a vow that held her still. She'd called him, her voice soft, her heart racing, and listened, her fear raw but easing. "I'm busy," he'd said, his voice tight, and she'd nodded, her tears falling, her heart lifting, his faith a bridge to a future she couldn't see. "You're enough," he'd said, and she'd clung to it, her love a flame that flickered but held. The phone, its buttons a puzzle, was more than a gift. It was a dream, a vow to learn, to rise, to stand by him. James's office was a cage, its walls heavy with doubt. He'd sat, his mind torn between John's shadow and Diep's light, and vowed to fight, to hold his world, to keep her safe. The papers, their ink a map of trust broken, were a fragile shield, their success a gamble. He'd thought of the farmers, their fields dry, their hands rough with hope, and smiled, his heart steady, his love a vow that held him still. The workers' voices lingered, their anger a fire he'd face, and he'd vowed to pay, to fight, to hold the dam that meant more than wealth. It meant life for them, for Diep, for a village that cradled his heart. Min walked away, his guitar a shield, his heart torn between passion and duty. He'd seen Diep, her tears, her kindness, and vowed to return, to chase a dream that wasn't music but her. His song, Country Girl, was a gift, a mirror to her pain, and he'd smiled, his heart heavy, knowing his choice, his storm was just beginning. Kien's warning lingered, a shadow that grew, and he'd stood, his eyes dark, his voice a vow to protect, to reveal, to break a trust he couldn't name. Tet was coming, its lanterns aglow against the dark, a promise of fortune she wanted to hold. Diep thought of James, his voice, his hands on her arm, his love a balm to her wound. He'd spoken of a farm, of fields heavy with grain, of a life they'd build, and she'd smiled, her heart wide as the hills. But her past lingered, a chain that whispered she wasn't enough, and Kien's warning, John's shadow, were clouds over James's world. The phone in her hand, the song in her heart, were steps toward a future she couldn't see. And the love she gave, to James, to hockey, to strangers with heavy bags, was a choice she made each day. She thought of the market, the pumpkins she'd sold, the water she'd given, the love that held them close. James had called, his voice a quiet strength, and she'd smiled, her heart racing, her hands still from scattering feed. "You're enough," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her fear raw but easing, his words a bridge to a future she couldn't see. The chickens clucked, their feathers bright in the dusk, and she smiled, her dream of a farm, a life with James, a spark that warmed her shack. James would come, his love a vow that held her still, but Kien's warning, John's shadow, were storms she couldn't name. The games of Tet were near, their cheers a hum she'd hear, and she thought of the market, its voices loud with hope. James had listened, his eyes soft with pride, and she'd smiled, her heart heavy with doubt. Enough for him, for his world? She'd fed the chickens, tended hockey, and thought of the song, the phone, her labor in the fields. James had stayed, his voice low with plans. "We'll build," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart trembling, her eyes on the fields, their green a hope she clung to. Her past was a wound, but his faith was a balm, and she wanted to trust it, to believe it could endure the storm. Questions lingered, soft as moonlight, heavy as earth. Would she rise or falter under Kien's warning? Would James unravel John's mystery, or lose his world to the workers' anger? Would Min's choice, his vow to chase her, break the love she held? Would their farm, their dreams stand strong, or would doubt, hers, his worlds, pull them apart? She thought of the chickens, the field she'd worked, the love that held her heart close, and James's voice, "You're enough," a vow that warmed her shack. Would their dream endure, a seed in Tet's glow, or wither under storms too heavy? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound, faint but deep, that pulsed with every breath. Sleep would come later, broken by hockey's whines and the creak of the shack's walls. For now, Diep stood by the stream, the moon high, the village quiet save for its endless hymn. She thought of James, of Min's song, of the love they'd forged in dust and pain. The answers weren't here, not yet. They lay beyond the hills in a dawn she couldn't see, and as she turned back to the shack, her steps steady, her soul burned, a flame that trembled but didn't die.